So my initial mastering stuff was mostly like old school, like transfer engineer, but in the digital age. And then the band Neurosis had their own label, Neurot Records, and they had a side project that was called Tribes of Neurot. And those guys I knew from the neighborhood, and I'd been a fanboy of Neurosis for years already at that point. And they asked us to mix and master this experimental album that they wanted to play simultaneously with the album Times of Grace. Wow. So I mixed and mastered Grace, which was their like soundscape album that's meant to be played simultaneously with the Albini recorded one.
Wow.
And that was kind of my first one where that was like, okay, I think I can do this. Like I can do this stuff for other people and not just for myself. Other than it was just like awesome to work with them, spend like, 2 weeks or a week and a half or whatever it was, just like hunched over workstation, kind of going through this kind of cool soundscapey experimental album that they'd made was awesome.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, and that's another really interesting side of you that I didn't really know too much about. I mean, archival is a super important job. And for those of you who are actually listening on this podcast and thinking about like places in audio that you can do, I think archival is going to be one of the most important things that we do in the future. And preserving legacies and stuff like that and seeing them through to other formats.
Yeah.
Right? You're seeing that a lot now with the whole Dolby Atmos thing where old records that were in stereo are being remixed, remastered, and preserved in this new format. I think that's always going to be a thing. So it's really important to understand that, mastering in many ways can also just mean restoration or just archival. And in my experience, it was much of that in the beginning too. I did a lot of archival work. I was an intern at Masterdist, and we would just always be constantly taking, old DATs, putting them onto CD as well. Sometimes we had tape and we had to roll that into a CD because they were like, we got to get rid of this stuff because we just, we need a downsize on the room. So I was like, okay. So my entire day was just that.
I have two like old DAT players here that I recently acquired, like trying to get my stuff off of DAT before the tapes just die. And that's been a nightmare. The DAT recorders have not lasted well. The tapes don't hold up. It's like, wow. Stuff just sitting there is just starting to kind of stop.
And it's interesting because that is it's analog tape, but it's printed with zeros and ones. So it's this,
it's magnetic tape.
So you're basically like at the mercy of analog tape degradation. So there is a certain time window when all of this stuff needs to get transferred or it's going to be lost forever. Kind of scary in a sense there. So here's an interesting question. I mean, like, what are, when it comes to things like as a mastering engineer and what you listen for, and you've worked with bands like Neurosis, you've done Cattle Decapitation and all these kinds of things, but you're listening to this music coming from a musician standpoint, but with the capabilities of a mastering engineer. What do you notice that makes music special for you? Like, what is it that modern musicians need to focus on in order for them to create something great?
When you get to be like a kind of an experienced audio engineer, sometimes it's too easy to focus on, is that mic placed right? Or, maybe you should use a different mic, or, maybe the levels weren't great when they recorded, or I hear some noise. Like, it's easy to hear the problems with things. But I find sometimes when I'm mastering stuff that has production problems, the song still kind of comes through. And it still has a feel. There's like, you're getting what the person's trying to say. And sometimes those are still more fun to work on than ones that are more technically correct, whatever that means, where there aren't problems. I'm not hearing crackles and distortions, and like, it's gotten to the point where like I've gotten mixes from engineers that artists were working with, and I'm like, I think you have a cabling problem somewhere in your studio, because where the noises I'm hearing sound to me like weird, like patch bay glitchy stuff. And they're like, what are you talking about? And then a week later, they're like, oh yeah, the engineer looked and found what you were talking about. How did you hear that? So, I can hear stuff that even people in the studios miss. And I mean, that's part of a mastering engineer's job. And if you're not careful, that can kind of ruin music for you.
Mm-hmm.
You get hung up on the things that aren't working about it technically. But I think at the end of the day, it's like you want people to feel something, whatever that is, even if it's an intellectual thing, or it doesn't have to be an obvious emotion. But I think it's like you should focus on saying something with your music, even if it's just you can't put it into words, because that's why we do music a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, the technical stuff's important. The production values need to meet a certain threshold, so they're not distracting from what you're trying to do. But I think sometimes people forget with how overproduced everything is, or how easy it is to overproduce everything, that at the end of the day, it's still about like somebody feeling something, or making their minds sort of think about certain things because of your music. And that, I think, is still the goal.
That's a great way to put it. And I mean, I have a question. Mm-hmm. Do you prefer bands tracking at the same time, or are you a fan of just overdubs, sending it to other people and tracking that way?
So lately, in recent years, I've done very few full band records. But when I was doing that, I would say if they're all doing it at the same time, and especially if they're in the same room and there's just like putting gobos up to try to isolate things, depends more on like how well that's done. Like when that's done really well, when it's like the musicians are really good and it's recorded really well, then that's easier to deal with than like tons of overdubs done over series of weeks in different places. But when there's problems with that, it's like you're really limited if they all play at the same time, especially if there's any bleed between mics, between musicians. I guess it's more in mixing, but even in mastering, it still leads to problems.
Right.
But I don't do that much of that stuff these days. I'm mostly doing, even if it sounds rock oriented, it was like still very overdubbed. I mostly do electronic records these days, but a lot of the electronic stuff, this could still be someone singing and playing guitar, they're just doing it with samples and libraries and things like that for the drums and what have you.
Do you find yourself being able to tell whether somebody did it as a full recording with a band in a room or it was overdubbed?
I don't think I think I kind of know. Like, I know what's happening before I start working on it, because I talk to them ahead of time and figure out how they worked on it, and where if you recorded, what was the situation, how was this recorded, who mixed it. So I kind of know already. But that panel I was on at AES with Kia and Mark, guy from Berkeley. I'm totally forgetting his name. Feel bad about that. I met you there. Dan, yeah, maybe. Dan, I think it was. We had to listen through like 16 different productions to kind of judge them and see which students kind of won that category. Yep. And there was a lot of them that were somebody by themselves in a bedroom using samples, and then maybe going into a studio to track a few things. And then there was stuff that was full, nice university recording studio, Neve consoles and every mic you want. And some of that stuff I could definitely tell, and some of it was like you really had to listen. You're like, oh, okay, if they hadn't told me they were using sampled drums, I would have noticed, but maybe I would have had to listen through. I would have been halfway through the song before I was like, hey, wait a sec. This doesn't sound like... at the same time, a lot of metal records, by the time they're done being mixed, they've been replaced. Everything's been replaced and chopped up anyways, so that can make it trickier, but...